The scripture reading comes from the book of Genesis 21, 1 through 3, and 22, 1 through 14. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, and he said, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. Some time later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show to you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on top of the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from the heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." This is a really hard passage, and I've struggled with it all week. I've wrestled with this passage. I've opened up books and read commentaries and dove into the original languages and tried to figure out what exactly is going on here. And maybe you have some of that same instinct, and you know why I struggled so much with this passage this week. It's because it's a hard passage. At the end of the day, this passage is about God calling a guy to go murder his son, and then the guy just goes with it. God says, "Abraham, I want you to go and sacrifice your son." And Abraham says, "All right, pack up the donkey. Let's get going." Throughout the entire story, he seems to show very little pushback or any kind of regret or anything. He just goes with it and really doesn't say all that much. It's also hard because this passage has been used in some pretty terrible ways in the past in the history of our church. Big C Church, the Church Universal. It's been used to justify calling people to do things that are just absolutely terrible, sacrificing their families, maybe figuratively, but giving up everything in order to go and serve God, or more likely be more involved in the church. It's been used to cause great amounts of harm to family, to disregard the needs of children, to put other people on the back burner, saying, "No, everything to God first. Your children even come second." I want to be clear. There is no amount of explanation or reframing that can take away all of the problematic characteristics of this text. And that's going to be true. It's a text that's a few thousand years old. It came from a different time, a different place, a different cultural framework. And trying to take it and put it into today's morality is going to break some things. And we have to just be ready for that. When we read, especially the Hebrew Bible, it isn't just one for one, copy, paste, it fits in today's world. God asks for a child human sacrifice. That's a thing. That's a thing that people all around Abraham in his culture were doing, regularly sacrificing their babies and their young children to gods. It was a commonplace cultural thing, and we shouldn't be surprised that Abraham doesn't balk at it. Why would he? All of the rest of the gods want child sacrifices. Why wouldn't the God of Israel? And Abraham doesn't question it. We say today, well, no, I would challenge even God if it came to a choice between God and my child. But that's just not part of the cultural identity that Abraham exists in. And that's going to be a problem for us. And we have to be willing to let those exist and to let those be in tension, but we can't let them completely destroy it as we dive into this passage. We can hold those in tension, but we also need to recognize we can work around them just a little bit to maybe find some truth in the midst of maybe things that don't fit into our culture today. First, I want to point out this little bit of wisdom that the story is a test for Abraham. That's the thing. It isn't about Isaac. It isn't about the servants. It really isn't servants. It isn't really about the sacrifice. This is a test for Abraham. The writer comes out and tells us right at the beginning, sometime later, God tested Abraham. We know what this is. And from the benefit of hindsight, we know Abraham's going to pass. We know that. From the benefit of hindsight, we know Isaac doesn't die. The writer is just clearing that up, and he doesn't want us to get bogged down too much in that. Just God's testing Abraham. Here's what we can look at. It's almost as if to say, look, I know this is going to be rough. I know this is going to be problematic, but just keep reading. The second piece within that is that Isaac is kind of depicted as a little bit of an object, which is a problem. That children are just sort of things. They're belongings for the patriarch. Same way with wives and daughters and possessions and slaves. All of these things simply just belong to powerful men. And so Isaac can be used as a testing object. That's a problem for us. But we can work through those kind of separately. The second little piece that we want to dig into is that this is a test for God. God is allowing God to be tested. And it's really hard to wrap our heads around what that means. What does it mean for God to make God's self vulnerable in the state of a test? Because if it's not a test, then that's some kind of just sick kid with a magnifying glass, right? Like if God already knows what the outcome of the test will be, then it's not really a test. It's just beating up on Abraham. That's not a God I'm comfortable with. And maybe it's a God that you are. I don't know. But we have to work through that God is allowing God's self to be tested. And God is still allowing us to have free will. Abraham can choose to say, no, this is my son now. You go away. Abraham could do that. He has free will. But instead, he submits to this testing that God and he are both going through. God has promised to bless Abraham and the offspring of Abraham. What if Abraham does fail the test? What happens then? Does the promise keep going, or does that nullify the promise? Does Abraham surrender the blessings that he had been given? What happens then? I mean, we don't have to dig too deep into that. We don't want to get too far in the weeds. But as we're kind of digging through this, it's important for us to remember that we're going in this test with all of the cards on the table. There is any outcome possible. Abraham could pass. Abraham could fail. Maybe Abraham would be successful in killing Isaac. Would God bring Isaac back from the dead? What happens in some of these other world sort of conversations? We don't know when we start the passage. And sometimes it's a benefit for us to kind of erase our minds and read as though we've never read before. As we're wrestling through this and we're bringing our problems to be in tension with this text, as we are pulling out whatever wisdom that we can find in it for today's world, we can almost see similar wrestling happening within the passage. Remember, Abraham has 3 whole days to travel with his son and these 2 servants all the way to the region of Moriah. What did they talk about? What was the conversation over the course of these 3 days? Did nobody ask where they were going? What did Abraham say? Did nobody say, hey, we've got the knife, we've got the fire, we've got the wood. Where is the lamb? Maybe even when they were getting packed, Abraham said, hey, go and put the blanket on the donkey and get the donkey ready to go. And the guy said, oh, well, do we need to get a lamb? No, don't worry about that. Okay, I guess, if you know what you're talking about. As they're traveling, and are they passing other mountains as they're going, and they're going, hey, let's worship here. Nope, we have a different one. No, let's worship here. No, we're going to keep going. Why 3 days of a journey? I'm sure everybody's looking at Abraham like he's going insane. Where are we going? And Abraham must just be so deep in thought, reconciling these ideas. We even see this come into really clear focus when Isaac asks Abraham just straight up. As they're going up, Isaac is carrying the wood. Abraham is carrying maybe a torch or a flint and steel, something like that, and the knife. And Isaac's putting stuff together. He's putting it together in his head. He says, hey, we have all of the stuff to build an altar. We have all of the stuff to have a burnt offering. But we don't have a lamb. Where is the lamb? Abraham just simply responds, God's going to provide the lamb. Don't worry about it. But let's dig just a little bit deeper. Who's asking this question? I mean, obviously we know it's Isaac. But what I'm asking is, who is Isaac at this point? Is it 8-year-old Isaac? A young Isaac who's struggling to carry all the wood that they need? And he says, Daddy, where's the lamb? We've done this a few times. I've done this with you. Where's the lamb for it? Or is it a teenager or even a young adult who looks at his dad and says, hey, Dad, we've been doing this for years. I know that we need a lamb. Where's it coming from? Does it change your perspective on the story if it's 16, 17, 18-year-old Isaac versus 5, 6, 7-year-old Isaac? Abraham builds the altar up, and I'm sure that's an intricate process of stacking the wood, getting it ready. And then he looks at his son and says, hey, I need you to climb on top of it. And he binds his hands and his feet like a lamb ready for slaughter. Isaac, at this point, presumably knows what's happening. As a little kid or as an adult, he's seen this happen before. He knows where this is going. And the knife comes up and the knife comes down. And in this moment, this is the moment where so many people focus. The knife coming down. And then an angel comes down from heaven. And I love most of the artists depict some variation of an angel coming and chopping his arm, catching his arm in some way to cause the knife to fall to the ground. We don't actually get that in Scripture. We get a voice that just calls out. Abraham almost ready to hear the voice. But I like the artist, like, ka-cha, chop it out of his hand. And then God reiterates his promise of blessing Abraham and blessing generations through him. This is a hard passage and leaves us lots and lots of questions, lots and lots of room for discussion and discernment. It leaves us lots of rabbit holes to run down and maybe get lost in and not find anything at the bottom. But that's the way Hebrew scripture works. It's giving us room for discussion, giving us room for discernment, giving us room for meditation. That's its point. It wants us to dig and dig and dig and wrestle with God and wrestle with one another, discerning truth. And so as history has gone on, there's a few interpretations that have risen to the top. These are not meant at all to be all of the interpretations. There are many, many, many perspectives on this passage. But these are the few that I wanted to bring out today. The first is that Christians have read this passage and have often not missed some of the imagery that comes up that is very Christ-like, right? They travel for how many days? 3 days. And they travel to the top of a what? A mountain. The wood that Isaac carries that builds his own altar, wood, or aiz in Hebrew, is the same word that gets used to describe the cross. Jesus carries his tree, and then Isaac carries his own trees. The son carries his own source of sacrifice. There's a sacrifice of the only beloved son. Even some traditions have Isaac actually being killed. The knife plunges, and then God brings Isaac back to life. We don't see that in our scripture, but some traditions hold that. They believe that Isaac was actually slain and brought back to life, even after 3 more days. It gets very messianic. And then there's the idea of one thing dying in the place of another. The idea of the ram that's ultimately slaughtered instead of the son. But my personal favorite goes like this. And it's a little more complicated because there's the Hebrew languages involved. So try to follow me if you can. In Hebrew, God doesn't actually tell Abraham to slay his son. It's not actually what it says. It does say it, but it's through something, it's heavily implied. It's implied by the text that Abraham is supposed to slaughter his son, but it's not actually what it says. To be clear, the translators aren't wrong in one sense. It does say, sacrifice him here as a burnt offering. But in another equally true sense, it doesn't say that. It's much like the wolf who says, "Oh, I'd love to have you for dinner," when he invites the pigs to his house. "Please come to my house. I'd love to have you for dinner." Have you at my house for dinner or have you on my plate for dinner? They're both equally true in that sentence, and they can both equally be correct translations and interpretations. And so there's a little bit of space in there that God is leaving as he speaks. What it literally says is, go to the land of Moriah and raise him up there for a burnt offering on one of the mountains. So go to Moriah, raise him up for a burnt offering, and do it on one of the mountains. Typically and colloquially, this is one of those turns of phrases that means raise him up in the form of smoke, i.e. burn him so that his smoke is raised up to God. But an interpretation that's really popular is, especially in ancient Jewish texts, is to raise him up to the top of the mountain, do the burnt offering, and then bring him back down. There is room to interpret it this way. And my favorite piece of this is kind of posted from a different interpretation, but I love that they kind of work together. And the idea is that the ram is already there when they come up to the top of the mountain. This idea that Abraham and his son come up the top of the mountain, and already the ram is there in the bushes and, calling out because he's stuck. And Abraham simply doesn't see it because he's so focused on the thing that he has to do. It's not until God opens his eyes and reveals more deeply what's going on in the world around him that Abraham sees what he's actually supposed to do. As we look at these different interpretations, and as we think about our own interpretations as we dive into that passage, I have a little bit of a deeper question that I'd like to ask. Why is it that we focus on the moment when the angel smacks the knife out of his hand? Why is it that when we think about this story, when we name it, the little title heading in a lot of our Bibles will say the sacrifice of Isaac or the binding of Isaac or some variation of that? There's usually something about the testing, the binding, the sacrifice, the slaying of Isaac. It's that moment that we focus on as the knife comes down. But Abraham doesn't do that. Sure, it's the moment that we're building up to, the moment that the whole story is driving toward. But when it's all said and done, Abraham doesn't say, I'm going to name this place where Isaac lived. I'm going to name this place the Lord spared. He doesn't say any of those things. Instead, he names it the Lord will provide. It seems that for Abraham, the moment with the knife coming down is not what was, the moment that we should be paying attention to is not what was almost taken, or that he was stopped from sacrificing his son, but that God ultimately provides, which would have been true if Abraham had ultimately sacrificed his son, which God gave him, or the ram, which God gave him. For Abraham, the point of this test is that no matter what the outcome is, God will provide. I think the challenge of this passage for us is to remember that everything that God asks us to give, all of the sacrifices that we're asked to give up, are ones that he already gave to us. This morning, as we gather either here in person or as we gather around this video, this time that we're sacrificing is life that God already gave us. The skills or the abilities that God has given us to serve in the church or serve on teams or in ministry are skills and strengths that God already gave us. The tithes and the offerings or other giving that we do to further the work of God's kingdom are things and ways that God has already provided. Our challenge and our test is to trust in God's provision. And that's hard. It's to continue down the paths as we feel called toward them. And to trust that no matter where that path goes, no matter what turn it takes, God will continue to provide again and again and again. This week's call to action is a little bit different, I think, than the past. Because I see this interaction that Abraham has as a challenge for our lives. What does it look like when we are traveling to the mountain and going up the mountain and we are so sure we know exactly what God is calling us toward? And then we have to take a left turn because God says, hey, the plan is changing. What does it look like when we've been working a career or we've been living our life in a certain way and then God says, okay, now we're taking a shift? What does it look like when a church program has been successful for years and years and years, or something in our lives it seems to be the way that we're supposed to be going? It seems so clear, but then something comes along and tells us, nope, we're going in a different direction now. Maybe you see that in your own life, or you see that in your workplace or your career. Maybe you see it in our church or in our community. Wherever it is, I want to invite you this week to open yourself, to be in prayer and discernment about the paths God is making available to you. Even if you're on the right path, is there maybe something God has already put in place that's going to change the way that you continue down it? This passage is hard. I'm going to name that, and I'm going to claim that. This week, I want to just imagine with you what it looks like for the church to process through hard passages like this. I've presented to you a set of ideas and a set of intuitions and a product of my study and a product of my own prayer and discernment and wrestling with God. But it's only my study and my perspectives and my prayer and wrestling and discernment. Many people have gone many directions with this passage. Many understandings have come out of it. Part of my work this week was reading through several of those and putting them in conversation with each other and trying to figure out what is going on in this passage based on this conversation that people are having throughout time and throughout places and throughout even religious backgrounds. What does it look like for us to do that as a church? To come to these difficult passages and work through them together as a community who travels down one path, who discerns together, and who takes that load on together. I pray that that might be true in your life and in mine.